Our first speaker is Putnam from UMass Amherst, and she's presenting on sea squirts, shrimps, and seaweeds. Oh my, Gulf of Maine invaders and who to watch out for. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks, Will. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Putnam, and I'm a third-year PhD candidate in the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass Amherst and a member of the RISCC leadership team. I'm a marine ecologist who focuses on New England coastal habitats, local and invasive invertebrates and algae, species interactions, and the influence of climate change. Today, I'm going to briefly talk about marine invasive species within the Gulf of Maine and a couple projects and experiments that I'm working on involving invasives and range expanding marine species. We learned a lot yesterday about marine invasive species in the Northeast and the Gulf of Maine during our marine session, so I'll only give a brief recap. In the Northeast, we have a greater proportion of invasives that are macroalgae, crustaceans, and tunicates, which we typically see colonizing estuaries, rocky shores, as well as human substrates such as docks. Examples on this slide show a variety of tunicates, shrimps, and seaweeds currently invasive to the Northeast and Gulf of Maine. Currently, 65 plus invasive species have been discovered in the Gulf of Maine. However, we know that climate change is affecting most living systems, and with the Gulf of Maine being one of the fastest warming ocean bodies, this number is likely to increase as southern species shift their range northward and species from other regions are transported into this new suitable habitat. Yesterday, you heard from Jeremy Miller, who runs the Community Science Marine Invader Monitoring and Information Collaborative, on the importance of monitoring for invasive species. These types of groups and other state and local agencies use species lists to proactively monitor and survey. However, in a world undergoing rapid change, we know that species lists must keep up. I'm part of a USGS project involving the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, where we are analyzing biodiversity in mixed coarse intertidal habitats across the islands. And part of the picture of biodiversity includes invasive and range expanding marine species. Through this work, I've developed a database of confirmed invasive invertebrates and algal species for the Boston Harbor, documenting 39 species, including information on their taxonomy, life history, and ecological and environmental impacts. This database is now being reworked to encompass the whole Gulf of Maine region. In addition, I developed a similar second database, a watch list for the entire Gulf of Maine of species with potential to become invasive, either through range shifting by climate change or human introduction. Our plenary speaker, Stosh Burgel, mentioned yesterday the need for horizon scanning as part of efforts on invasive species, and that's the intention of the bulk of this work. This information is being built and intended for management to use for decision-making on prioritization for surveillance and monitoring. Examples of species on the confirmed list are on the left, the gold star tunicate, orange striped anemone, and the Asian shore crab. Examples of a few species on the watch list are on the right, the mitten crab, wakame seaweed, and an invasive grass shrimp. Management of marine invasive species is challenging due to the high connectivity of marine ecosystems, and total eradication is often unable to be achieved. Alternative strategies include management of population sizes to levels which will lower negative impacts. However, it's crucial to know which species and what their potential impacts are in order to make a decision around this management. One way I'm working towards this is by using a modified impact assessment to determine the positive and negative impacts of species from the confirmed and watchlist databases. An extensive and comprehensive literature search occurs for each species. All papers are reviewed and then assigned an impact score based on the level and type of documented impact. This will then be synthesized and used for managers and other stakeholders in decision-making. In addition, it's extremely important to project and proactively survey for species that may have the potential to be invasive under future climate change scenarios. I plan to use species distribution models and environmental niche models for species on the watch list to determine how likely a species is able to establish and also to predict potential suitable habitat within the Gulf of Maine under future climate change scenarios. Lastly, it's important to understand how climate change may impact invasive and local species and the resulting changes in the community. Laboratory experiments are super useful, but sometimes can introduce artifacts and don't allow things to play out the way they naturally would in the field. To try to get at this, I've developed a field experiment to determine how increased temperatures affect settling and competing invasive, range expanding, and local barnacle species, 2 species which are listed on the watch list. In this experiment, black settlement tiles absorb solar radiation and increase in temperature by up to 5 degrees. This increase in temperature is sort of like a proxy for future climate change scenarios. This experiment was installed in various locations in southern New England in June of 2021 and will extend through fall of 2023 to account for individual species phenology and to look at long-term effects of increased temperature. Here are a couple more examples of the species on the watch list, and thank you for your time.
Great, thanks, Allie, for an awesome presentation. And folks, if you have questions for Allie, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end of the session. All right, so I am up next, so I'll just see if I can share my screen and I'll get started here. All right. So I'm presenting on a project that I'm calling Where Did You Come From and Where Did You Go? The Cotton Eye Joe of Invasive Plant Species. So I figured everyone could use a good earworm. So there we go. Before I start, I just want to say thank you to some folks that are also working on this project. So my advisor, Bethany, as well as 5 undergraduate students who have all done some pretty amazing work to help us out with this project. So Michael, Julia, Mike, David, and Fatima, thank you all so much. So there are 3,228 plant species that have measurable negative impacts in at least one location in the world. So in terms of our project, these are the species that we're most interested in. In other words, these are all of the documented vascular invasive plant species in the entire world. So for each one of these species, we'd like to know a couple of different things. First, where did they originate and where have they invaded? So that is the Cotton Eye Joe part of this, is we'd like to know the countries that they have evolved in and then the countries that they've invaded in. We'd also like to know how they got there. So what transportation pathway did these species use to relocate to the environments where they've invaded? And so to give you a sense of a transportation pathway, zebra mussels have famously invaded through ballast waters. So that's an unintentional transportation pathway. And lots of invasive plant species are moved through intentional pathways. So they're moved around for horticultural or ornamental purposes. And the third thing we'd like to do is we'd like to know how can managers use this information to prevent future invasions. So I'm mainly going to focus on the first 2 bullet points here today because we really need to answer those first before we get to that third question. So to give you a sense of some of the data that we're collecting, so this is one of our 3,000 invasive plant species, so commonly known as groundsel bush, salt bush, or consumption weed. So the first question is we have to document that it has negative impacts, tangible negative effects somewhere, and the common names there are kind of a giveaway. Salt bush is because it survives in really, really salty environments. So along roadsides is a common place to find it, and consumption weed is because it's very toxic to both humans and livestock. So definitely has tangible negative impacts. So it kind of passes our first check there. The next question is where did it come from and where did it go? We know that it's native to the southeastern United States as well as Cuba and the Bahamas. So that's where did it come from? Where did it go are the red countries on here. So that's France and Spain, as well as Georgia and Australia. And then how did it get there? So we're looking at probably at least 2 different separate introductions. So we could potentially have multiple introduction pathways for this, but the literature pretty clearly shows us that the species was always introduced for ornamental purposes. So it was introduced intentionally. It's got white showy flowers and it makes a really nice dense bush. And so it's visually appealing, which is likely the reason that it was moved. So we can collect this information for all 3,000 of our species, and then we can tally up some of the results to start to get a picture of how invasive species are moving around the globe. And so these are not finalized results by any means, and it's also tough to take them at face value because there are lots of things that could affect how many species are coming from a given country or how many species are invading a given country. But just to give you some idea of the results that we've started to get from this project, we see China, Russia, and India as the 3 countries where most invasive plant species are originating from. But as you can see, they're not clearly distinguished from each other, and there's a lot of other countries that are also some pretty major contributors as well. But if we look at the most commonly invaded countries, the United States really stands alone at the top there. And like I mentioned, this could be for a lot of reasons. We could have an abundance of research on the invasive plants in our country as compared to other countries. So it really depends on a lot of different factors to explain what's going on here. But that's something that we're going to look into and then try to figure out how we can use that information moving forward to help prevent some of these invasions. So that is my whirlwind tour of the Cotton-eye Joe of invasive plant species. I want to thank you all for listening and thank my funding sources as well. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function, or you can reach out to me afterwards. My email's on there, and so is my Twitter. So yeah, please reach out if you'd like to talk more about this. All right, and then our next speaker is Bianca Lopez from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And Bianca will be presenting on how do invasions interact with environmental change to affect ecosystems. So Bianca's already got everything set up, so take it away, Bianca.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, so I am an editor at Science now, but I'm going to talk about this recent research project that I did while at UMass and working with the RISC group with this whole group of amazing scientists listed below here. And this project is currently in revision for publication. So like probably everyone who's tuning in here, I am concerned by the fact that these multiple global change stressors, including invasive species, but also environmental changes like climate change and pollution, such as added nitrogen, are having these profound and often negative impacts on ecosystems. And in this study, I really wanted to look at how invasive species, in addition to these environmental changes, are affecting ecosystems. So one of the main questions that RISC research tries to answer. Specifically, I wanted to know, will the combined effects of invasive species and environmental change be worse than the single effects of just one of them? And will these two different types of stressors interact with one another? So if you have both invasive species and an environmental change like warming temperatures, will you see an additive effect where what you see on the ecosystem is basically just what you would expect if you added up the invasive species effect with the warming effect? Or will they interact in some way to have a weaker or stronger effect than you'd expect? So for example, it's been seen in a bunch of different studies that in some cases, an environmental change like warming temperature might knock back the invasive species or make it have less of an impact on the ecosystem. Whereas, as many of you have probably even observed on your own, warming temperatures, as an example, can increase the severity or the impact of an invasive species. And so that's kind of the worst case scenario, is if we see these much bigger impacts on the ecosystem than we'd expect when we have both of these things acting at the same time. So to look at this question, we did a meta-analysis of 95 published experiments. Each of these experiments added an invasive species, a plant, animal, or fungus, but most of them were plants. They also looked at the effects of an environmental condition that mimicked a global environmental change factor, so warming, drought, or added nitrogen were most of what they looked at, and then looked at these two things, the invasive species and environmental change, together and compared them all to a control. These studies looked at effects on native populations or communities or on the whole ecosystem, and I'm going to talk about impacts on a broad scale across all experiments and across these different types of ecological responses. So I'm going to show some results looking at the mean effects of these three different treatments, the environmental change, invasive species, and both of them together across the different studies. And this dotted line that's going across here is if the mean effect was 0, and then anything above it is a mean positive effect, and below it is a mean negative effect. So what we found was that across all the global environmental changes, there was a lot of variation in positive and negative effects. And so the mean effect was not significantly different from 0. Whereas for invasive species, well, we also saw both positive and negative effects, probably not surprising, but the mean effects were negative across the studies. And I will mention a caveat is that drought effects on average were also negative. So this non-zero environmental change effect was really because of temperature and nitrogen having kind of a whole range of effects on the ecosystem. And so these invasion effects tended to be negative. And when both the invasive species and the environmental change were acting at the same time, those effects tended to be a little bit worse, but not significantly different, as you can see here, from just when you had the invasive species on their own. So that was happening because most of the time, in most cases, the invasion and environmental changes were somewhat weakening each other's impacts. So it's not like you would get the same effect as if you just added them both together. It was usually a little bit less severe than you would expect. So maybe they cancel each other out a little bit. But I will say that in about a quarter of the cases, we did see the opposite effect, where actually the invasion and the environmental change together had an even stronger than expected impact. So sort of these worst case scenarios were not totally uncommon in this study. But overall, I just want to kind of recap that across all of these studies at this kind of coarse scale, we saw that invasion effects on average were negative and worse than temperature and nitrogen effects on ecosystems. But those environmental changes did not generally make invasion effects much worse. So usually there was some kind of canceling out of those impacts. And so there was often not a much worse impact than you would see with just the invasive species on its own. That wasn't always the case, but what this does tell us, that's good news, is that it does seem from these studies that what we can learn is that local management of invasive species can have an impact even in the face of environmental change for mitigating some of the negative effects of global change on ecosystems. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Bianca. That was awesome. And again, folks, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function and we'll get to them at the end. So next up is Eve Beaury from UMass Amherst, who will be talking about ornamental invaders in a warming climate.
Hi, everybody. Just give me a second to get my computer set up. Okay, hi, I'm Eve Beaury. I just finished my PhD at UMass. I'm starting a new position in New Jersey in a couple of weeks. And right now I'm calling in from a small ski town in Colorado. So hopefully my internet's going to hold up for this short talk, but if I blip out, somebody wave their arms or something. So I'm going to be talking about some of the work that RISC has been doing over the past few years to try and understand and reduce the spread of ornamental invasives. So the biggest concerns being the ornamental invaders that are in other regions of the US that will have suitable habitat here in the Northeast with climate change. So we've been kind of working towards this goal of preventing new species from showing up here. Just to start, okay, so my slides are moving. Okay, just to start with a little bit of background, we know that horticultural trade is a really important pathway for the spread of non-native invasive plants and pests. A lot of these plant species are selected for garden plants because they have really hardy and fast-growing traits. And they're also often imported from warmer climates. So this gives them a really strong advantage to thrive in new areas as the climate gets warmer. I'm sure you've gathered this by now, but a lot of what the RISC network focuses on is bringing together efforts to manage invasive species across our region. And so a big focus of our work in the last few years has been trying to reduce the spread of invasives through horticultural trade. And so I'm going to briefly touch on a couple projects we've been thinking about across these three themes. So the first being identifying which invasive plants are still being marketed as ornamentals in New England. Trying to reduce their spread of the plants we already have here. And then third, which is the climate change piece, preventing the introduction of new ornamental invasives that we don't yet have as part of our horticultural trade, but which will have suitable habitat here out to 2050. So first, identifying which invasive plants are still marketed as ornamentals, even though we know they have negative impacts. To do this, we conducted standardized internet searches for sales of about 1,300 different plant species that are known to be invasive in the US. So here are some examples of what those searches looked like.
And across all the species we looked for, we found that 61% are still for sale as an ornamental plant, at least somewhere in the US. And this is through both online trade and on the ground nurseries. And then about 343 of the species we looked for are prohibited by the federal government or by individual state prohibited plant lists. So a bunch of high impact invasives are still being spread around as garden plants. And this work came out in Frontiers in the last year, and a research summary went out on the RISC Network website. So if you're interested in seeing more about this project, I'd be happy to share that with you. So because of that project, we figured out which invasive species are still being spread through horticulture. And in the last year or two, especially, we've been working a lot with our partners across the US, but especially in the Northeast, to make sure that prohibited plant lists are being used effectively and consistently across our region. So the first big step to doing that was to collate a regional prohibited plant list to serve as a resource across New England. So we've been working with our partners internally in the RISC network and our invasive plant folks to build this list. And we hope to have it in a searchable, shareable format sometime this year. So we've been working a lot with this internally, but hoping to get it on the website or out to the listserv at some point for everybody to look at. And so again, this doesn't have any regulatory power, but it is a really important resource that we can use as a region to start thinking about what ornamental plants we don't want anywhere in the region, not just in one individual state. And then the climate change piece of this is that we want to start thinking more proactively about what ornamental invasive plants are being spread commercially in other regions of the US that we don't want to become a part of our Northeast horticultural trade as the climate changes. So these are species that can potentially survive here or be used as garden plants here, but they're not here yet. And we know they're invasive and being spread as garden plants in other regions. So as I'm sure most of you know, New England is getting warmer, traditionally looking like hardiness zones 3, 4, and 5, and starting to look a lot more like 4, 5, and 6. And so that means a lot of our flora and fauna are going to shift. In previous work by members of the RISC team, they used climate change projections to try and identify which US invasive plants are likely to have suitable habitat in the Northeast out to 2050. And so we crosswalked that big list with what we know from our ornamental invaders work to identify the high impact invasive plants that could show up here really quickly through horticulture. So by putting those two data sets together, we came up with a list of 23 ornamental invasive plants that, again, aren't yet a big part of New England horticultural trade and that have suitable habitat here with climate change. So these are the species we really want to prevent from showing up here. And ideally, it's going to be an easy sell to the horticultural industry because they're not yet big popular garden plants. And this is another thing that we've been working a lot on internally, and we're hoping to see this list shared with the listserv sometime this year as well. And I just put up a few examples of the plants we've been thinking a lot about in the last year. So I have no idea how I'm doing on time, but just to repeat that, all of the resources I've mentioned and the research I've mentioned is either already published or on the way to being published and is accessible on the RISC website. We have been spending a lot of the last year brainstorming about where to send these different lists of ornamental plants and how to use them most effectively. So if you have ideas about that, please let us know. And thank you to all the folks who've already contributed to this work in the last couple of years. And so definitely stay tuned if you're not part of the listserv. Get on it because I think we've got a lot of exciting stuff coming out this year, especially with the ornamental work. Okay, that's all I have. I put my email address up there and my Twitter and all the RISC stuff. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Eve. That was an awesome talk. We'll move now over to Ayodelé Uhuru from UMass Amherst, who will be presenting on identifying the sleeper species of future invading plants in the face of climate change. So take it away, Ayo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction, Will. So again, my name is Ayo. I am a master's student here at UMass Amherst, and I have been researching identifying the sleeper species of future invading plants in the face of climate change. So starting off with just the basic definition of what a sleeper species is. Sleeper species are naturalized in a region, potentially invasive, but not yet invasive because they are limited by biotic or abiotic conditions. And I also just want to note that not all non-native species are going to be sleepers. A lot of species do just exist at low abundance rates and will never cause negative ecological harm. But another way to explain what this definition of a sleeper species is, I think it helps to use an example along with the figure from the Management Challenge on Sleeper Species that was published back in 2018 by the Risk Management Network. So looking at this example of a Germany sleeper species of cordgrass, in 1985, there was a establishment of cordgrass on the island of Sylt in 1985, where it was limited by unfavorable climate. But from the years 1985 to 2001, climate started to shift, which made it the increase of water temperature on the island to also gradually increase, which then created suitable habitat for these species to then awaken. And that is when they started to germinate a little bit quicker and establish more of a population. And then finally in 2001, that's when it was considered to be, this cordgrass population was considered to be invasive. So understanding these types of invasions known as, and knowing these sleeper species can help us in the future, and managers use these types of examples to establish management plans. So with the translational invasion ecology framework, I have been specifically focusing on the research of sleeper species. So we have been using the ICAT framework in finding sleeper species in the literature, which is the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa, which is a framework, a standard to quantify negative ecological impacts. So we are looking through Web of Science literature to find which species are rated from 1 to 4, 4 being major concerns, which for negative ecological impact, which is local extinctions and impacts at the population level. So from a list of 125 non-native plants in the Northeast, we found that, so from a list of 125 plants in the Northeast, and that they are not invasive, they are considered to be invasive elsewhere in the United States. 80 of those species were considered to have some type of negative ecological impact. 49 of those species were considered to be major concerns, are high priority impact species, and 31 of those also showed to have socioeconomic impacts, which basically was impacts to human health, agricultural, and the economy. So as an example, because I'm specifically looking for these sleeper species in the Northeast, we found that a possible sleeper species, just based off of the habitat codes of where it can establish and the fact that it was considered to be invasive in Wisconsin, we found that Buneus orientalis, or the Turkish water cabbage, could be a possible sleeper species in the Northeast region. So it likes to be it's found in temperate grasslands, and it likes to be found in disturbed habitats. When it invades meadows, it's out competing a lot of the native vegetation. It's found to be toxic to native insect herbivores, and it benefits off of drought. And because the climate is changing in the Northeast, and we are going to be seeing a lot more extreme weather, weathering events, drought is also in our future. And another thing about this possible sleeper is that it has the ability to resprout from root fragments, which means that it could be really hard to control or eradicate, which is just an example of a possible sleeper. So the goal of finding real-time sleepers is just being proactive and getting information out to those who need it, so we can avoid big-time invaders like the common kudzu. It's a known invasive throughout the Southeast, and it's a sleeper in the Northeast. If we can understand the impacts of this vine before it turns into this landscape, we can start thinking about management strategies to help the ecosystems most vulnerable to these types of sleeper species. And that's mainly the work that I've been working on. And I'd like to say thank you to Justin Salva and Ellie Hollow to have helped me out with the methods of this presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ayo, for a wonderful talk. And then lastly, so Ayo was the last of our research-focused talks, but now we'll have Justin Dalaba from Cornell University give us a walkthrough of some of our RISC resources. So Justin, if you're ready, go ahead and start.
All right, thanks, Will. So my name is Justin Dalaba, and I'm a communications coordinator at the New York Invasive Species Research Institute based at Cornell University. And I'm a relatively new face here with the RISC leadership team. So my goal for the next 5 minutes or so is just to give you a very quick walkthrough of some of the resources that we have to offer and hopefully find something that's useful and maybe spark interest for you. And I have to say, I was encouraged by our keynote speaker, Stash Burgel, yesterday when he mentioned that in putting his talk together, one of his first thoughts was to head over to riscnetwork.org for some of our resources. And that's really the goal. So for some of you, or many of you, I'd say that some of these resources may be familiar, but keep in mind as I'm going through this, we're always looking for areas to improve and where our information needs still need to be met. So for the new ears on the call, just to give you a very quick background, we operate as both a research team and a boundary spanning organization, actively trying to connect researchers and managers. And, you know, it's been encouraging to see throughout this symposium, the conversations happening throughout the chat and those relationships starting to happen. And that's really what it's all about. We want to see those conversations start through these symposia, and that's how the RISC network itself is built, is through these partnerships that happen at symposium workshops, and then it's carried out through those continued communications throughout the year. We also host around 2 to 3 webinars each year to share information on current and emerging issues, which you can find past examples of on our website, which I'll walk through in just a minute. And we offer these symposium workshops for free because these are really where we, as I mentioned, just start to build those networks and identify those information needs and get those needs met. And of course, we hope that these will look, you know, more like what you see pictured here in person again soon. And as easy as it is to do when we're all on distant screens, when we part ways today, we really don't want the conversations to stop here. So our more regular communications happen through our network and listserv, which we now have over 625 members on. I know it's been really plugged throughout this symposium, but you can see in the chat how to join our listserv, and know that that's not only a place for regular resource sharing, but it's also a platform for discussion. You can think of this as sort of the open forum for sharing resources and information needs. And now I'm going to dive into some of the ways really quickly that we work to make existing information more accessible and digestible in a digestible format. And one of those ways, which both Carrie and Tony Lynn have mentioned, and you've heard again throughout this symposium, is we put together these one-page syntheses of science, which we call management challenges. And this is really where we compile information from multiple papers to make it easy and quick to read. And you can find a number of these on our website. We now have 10 actually that you can find under our resources tab, including the most recent one, which I had the privilege of being a part in developing. And this covers the challenge of deciding between managing for resilience, resistance, or transformation, and what actions are required for successful management outcomes. We also put together regular research summaries, and this is where we read through individual scientific papers and bring to the surface key take-home points and management implications to save you the time of trying to find and read through these papers on your own. And you can find these again on our website, which are searchable by topic. And of course, when we're not summarizing existing research, we're actively working to produce original research. And these are 3 examples of papers that came out this year, one of which Eve just mentioned, and I know Tony Lynn had mentioned yesterday, this translational invasion ecology paper, which really embodies the role of the Northeast RISC as a boundary spanning organization. And so again, these all exist on our resources tab on our website and are shared through our listserv. And additionally, there are a number of existing tools that you might find useful for your own research and management decisions. And you can head over to our website to watch tutorials and learn more about these. For example, learning how to create a watch list of invaders that are moving to your state with climate change. And lastly, for a summary of what we're doing, you can read our guiding principles document that came out in 2020. And this really dives deeper into the resources that I mentioned and the mission behind that. And while this scrolls across your screen, I just wanted to wrap things up by saying, while we've had a really productive year, it's a constant effort building our capacity for improved communications. It takes many years and many people, and we're always evolving. And there will be an opportunity at the end of this symposium to share feedback and let us know what information is most useful to you. Where are there information needs still? And that'll be emailed out to you after the symposium. And if you are not already, as I mentioned, like I said, this has been plugged throughout the symposium, but join our network, sign up for our listserv, and you can follow our Twitter for more regular updates. And that's all I had.
Great, thanks for that overview, Justin. So I'd invite all of our speakers to go ahead and turn their cameras back on. So we'll do a really brief panel discussion here in the last couple of minutes. And there's a question that Eve and Bianca, I think you have already put some answers to, but I think it's a really great question. I want to see if you maybe want to elaborate on that or see if anyone else wants to chime in. So the question is, how do we work to change policy? Our prohibited plant list in Massachusetts favors plants that are already a huge problem. How can we be proactive with species that we know are likely going to become a problem? So does anyone want to elaborate or chime in on that?
Yeah, sure. Just because I think it's a really great question and something that we've been struggling with too, because I think we've spent a lot of the last couple of years just trying to understand how the regulations in the Northeast and across the US work and what some of the barriers are to being more proactive. And I feel like we've just recently figured that out in a way that now we can start pushing to make change. And so just to shout out some of the Northeast states that are doing some cool things, New York and Maine are going through kind of revising their regulatory lists now. And so their kind of starter pool of species that they're going through risk assessments for includes some of these range shifting invasives and ornamental invasives. And so they're trying to focus on the ones that are more likely to get here sooner because they update their regulations every 5 years. But so those species are starting to creep on to people's radar in terms of adding those to the regulatory lists. And then the other thing I said is that we're starting to encourage people to put watch lists online, even if they're not able to be implemented in policy, just because we think that there is a lot of value to having a list published by a group like the RISC Network or by these different plant councils, even if it's not regulatory, like it's still there and serves a good purpose. And a lot of the conversations we've had with horticulture people, at least in Amherst, have been really encouraging. People don't want to be spreading things or importing things that we already know have really high impacts. And so I think what we've been trying to do is really drill down to focus on the worst species and the ones we're most concerned about, hoping that that's going to be easier to convince people to avoid entirely. And then, yeah, Bianca had added the note that the other thing is like discouraging the bad stuff and encouraging the good stuff. And so that's been something we've been thinking a lot about in terms of encouraging people to plant native, but that, there's tons of barriers with access to native stock and what plants are least risky and all that stuff. So I think we're on the verge of being able to answer a lot of these questions and spent a lot of our time in the last couple of years just kind of understanding the framework for how it works in our region and elsewhere. And so if you have ideas on that, I think we're still looking to answer those questions too. So if you have thoughts, send them our way, because these lists are kind of on the burners, ready to go. And we're trying to figure out where to send them and how to use them effectively.
Great. Does anyone else have thoughts, ideas on that? I can add that just from a research perspective, that I think all those points were great, but that I think maybe across the board in terms of plants, but also Ali, thinking about your marine species too, that a lot of our invasive species studies focus on a single point in time and maybe don't capture the full invasion curve of what an invasion looks like from the time it's introduced all the way through to when it starts having impacts. And if we have more research that kind of follows species as they kind of establish and spread, that might enable us to be a little bit more convincing about which species we're labeling as potentially problematic and being a little bit more proactive about regulating. Any other final thoughts here before we wrap up?
I'll just throw in that there's so much amazing research out there about communicating messages about like climate change. And I think that I would like to see more research about how to talk to different audiences about either avoiding invasive species or getting excited about native species, stuff like that, because I think that part of it is like a branding problem. So that's all.
All right, well, thanks so much to all of our Lightning Talk speakers. This is a great session, and we're so glad to have had all of